March 12, 1943. Morning 6:30. A German prisoner of war camp in Poland. Corporal James Hartley woke up with the same sensation he experienced every morning: unbearable hunger. His stomach felt hollow, empty, as if it had been consuming itself throughout the night. He had been a prisoner of war for approximately 6 months. In that time, he had lost more than 40 pounds. His clothes hung on his body like rags. His ribs were visible through his thin shirt. The first activity of the day was breakfast. Breakfast consisted of a small cup of dark liquid that was supposed to be coffee but tasted like burned grain, and a piece of bread approximately the size of a postage stamp. Hartley stared at the piece of bread. It was hard, almost like stone. It was brown and dense. It was, in essence, the only substantial food he would receive during the day. He broke the bread apart and examined it. Embedded in the bread were bits of what might have been straw or sawdust, substances that were added to bread to increase its volume without increasing its nutritional value. Hartley ate the bread slowly, chewing each small piece for as long as possible to extend the meal. The hunger was so intense that he wanted to swallow the bread immediately, but he forced himself to chew slowly. He had learned that this made the bread seem to fill his stomach more completely. This is the story of what prisoners of war actually ate in the camps during the Second World War. It is not a story about adequate nutrition or fair rations. It is a story about systematic starvation, about the creative and often desperate methods that prisoners employed to obtain additional food, about the physical and psychological consequences of chronic malnutrition. It is a story about how hunger became not simply a physical sensation but a psychological reality that consumed the thoughts and actions of men fighting for survival. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were to receive food rations that were equivalent to the rations provided to military personnel of the detaining power. In theory, this meant that prisoners held by Germany would receive food rations similar to those provided to German soldiers. In practice, the rations provided to prisoners were substantially lower than those provided to German soldiers. And more significantly, the rations were often inadequate to sustain human health and functioning, particularly for men performing forced labor. The typical daily ration for a prisoner of war held by Germany consisted of morning, a cup of dark liquid, supposedly coffee, and a small piece of bread, approximately 100 to 150 grams. Midday, a small bowl of soup, typically consisting of water, a few vegetables, and sometimes a small amount of meat. Evening, another small piece of bread, approximately 100 to 150 grams. The total caloric intake from official rations was typically between 1,000 and 1,500 calories per day. For comparison, a man performing heavy physical labor requires approximately 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day to maintain his health and functioning. Prisoners of war in camps were performing hard labor, digging, building, moving heavy materials, while consuming less than half of the calories necessary to sustain their bodies. The mathematics of this were clear and tragic. Prisoners were being systematically starved while being forced to work. A prisoner named Robert Chen described the mathematics. "We were receiving enough food to keep us barely alive, but not enough to maintain our strength. We were forced to work all day, performing hard labor, using up thousands of calories. And then we received back 1,000 calories. We were operating at a massive caloric deficit. Every single day, our bodies were consuming more than we were replacing. Every day, we were slowly dying of starvation. The bread provided to prisoners was not the nutritious bread that civilians might eat. It was a government-issue war bread designed for volume and cost-effectiveness rather than nutrition. The bread was dark, dense, and heavy. It was made from flour that contained flour from other grains, barley, rye, sometimes sawdust, or straw. The bread was difficult to digest, often causing intestinal distress in prisoners who were not accustomed to it. One piece of bread was supposed to represent the prisoner's entire daily carbohydrate intake. For many prisoners, bread became the primary focus of their existence. Prisoners dreamed about bread. Prisoners calculated how to maximize the satisfaction from their bread ration. Prisoners sometimes traded other food items or possessions for additional bread. A prisoner named William Grant described his relationship with bread. "The bread became an obsession. I thought about it constantly. I calculated how to extend it. I fantasized about eating multiple pieces of bread. The bread represented all the hope I had for the day. When I received my bread ration in the morning, I faced a fundamental choice. Eat it all at once and be satisfied for a few minutes before hunger returned, or portion it out throughout the day to extend the sense of having food. Most of us chose to portion it out. We would eat a small piece in the morning, a small piece at midday, a small piece in the evening. This way, we could maintain the illusion of having food throughout the day, even though the total amount was the same. But sometimes, the hunger would become unbearable and I would eat the entire day's bread ration at once. The satisfaction lasted only minutes. Then I was left with hours of hunger ahead of me and no food to address it. The midday meal was typically soup. The soup was designed to be liquid and filling, stretching limited ingredients to create volume. The typical soup consisted of water and vegetables, potato, turnip, carrot, boiled together. In the best cases, there might be a small amount of meat or bone broth. In many cases, the soup was simply vegetable scraps boiled in water. The quality of the soup varied considerably depending on the camp and the time period. In camps with reasonable management and adequate resources, the soup might be relatively substantial. In camps with poor management or depleted resources, the soup might be essentially hot salt water. A prisoner named David Kaufman described the soup. The soup was the event of the day. We would line up with our bowls, and the cook would ladle a cup of liquid into each bowl. The soup typically consisted of mostly water with a few soft vegetable pieces floating in it. I learned to be strategic about the soup. If I was ladle number 1, I would get mostly liquid. If I was ladle number 10, I might get a bit more solid material that had sunk to the bottom. So we would try to position ourselves in the line to maximize the amount of actual substance in our soup. Some men would extract the pieces of vegetable from their soup and save them, creating a kind of stew from accumulating pieces. Other men would drink the soup immediately while it was still hot, using the heat to create a sense of fullness in their stomachs. The soup was never satisfying. It never filled you up. But it was hot, and it provided a few calories, so we consumed it. Prisoners, desperate to supplement their meager rations, became creative in finding additional sources of food. Some camps had small gardens where prisoners could grow vegetables. Prisoners who had access to these gardens would steal vegetables, at great personal risk. Discovery of theft meant severe punishment, often beatings by guards. But the hunger was strong enough that some prisoners were willing to accept the risk. A prisoner named Thomas Mitchell described stealing from the camp garden. The camp had a vegetable garden guarded by German soldiers. The garden was, in theory, completely off-limits to prisoners. But the hunger was so intense that some men were willing to risk punishment to steal vegetables. I participated in this once. I was so hungry that I was willing to accept the risk. I managed to steal 3 small turnips. When I bit into that raw turnip, the taste and the substance were extraordinary. I felt like I had eaten a full meal, even though it was just 3 small turnips. I was caught the next time I attempted to steal. A guard saw me and beat me severely with a rifle butt. But I was willing to accept the punishment for the chance to eat vegetables. The hunger was that strong. As supplies dwindled, camps began issuing food substitutes that were not adequate substitutes for actual nutrition. In some camps, prisoners were issued a dark liquid that was supposed to be coffee, but that was actually made from roasted grain or even roasted tree bark. The liquid provided minimal nutrition and minimal taste, but it was hot, and for many prisoners, the heat provided a sense of comfort and fullness. In some camps, prisoners received a dark paste that was supposed to be butter or margarine, but that was actually made from oil seeds or other plant materials. The paste had minimal nutritional value but was used to supplement bread rations. In some camps, particularly late in the war when supply lines had broken down, prisoners received what was euphemistically called turnip soup, essentially boiled turnip water with minimal nutrition. A prisoner named Henry Wilson described the substitutes. By late 1944, the food had become increasingly strange and increasingly inadequate. We were receiving a dark liquid that was supposed to be coffee but that tasted like burnt wood. We were receiving a paste that was supposed to be butter but that had the consistency of mud. The camp command claimed these were nutritional supplements. They were nothing of the kind. They were substitutes created because the real food was simply not available. We were being starved not necessarily through deliberate policy, though that may have been part of it, but through the breakdown of supply systems and the reality of war and shortage. One of the most serious consequences of the inadequate diet was severe protein deprivation. Prisoners needed protein to maintain muscle mass and to repair their bodies. But the prison diet provided minimal protein. The occasional small piece of meat in the soup was the primary source of protein. Some camps provided a small amount of beans or lentils, but these were rare. The result was that prisoners' bodies were consuming their own muscle mass to survive. Prisoners developed the characteristic appearance of severe malnutrition. Thin, wasted bodies with visible ribs and bones, loose skin, diminished muscle mass. More seriously, the lack of protein led to physical deterioration that made recovery difficult or impossible. Men's immune systems weakened. Men became susceptible to disease. Men's bodies deteriorated to the point where even modest infections could become life-threatening. A military doctor who was a prisoner himself, named Dr. Marcus Bloom, described the effects of protein deprivation. I watched men's bodies deteriorate as a result of the protein-deficient diet. I could see it happening in real time. Men's muscles were wasting away. Men were becoming weaker. Men's bodies were consuming themselves from the inside. As a doctor, I understood the biochemistry. The body needs protein to maintain muscle. When protein is insufficient, the body begins to break down its own muscle to survive. Eventually, this reaches a critical point where the body begins to break down the muscles of the heart, and the person dies. We were not being dramatically starved, we were receiving some food. But we were being chronically, systematically starved in a way that was slowly destroying men's bodies from the inside. Beyond basic calories and protein, prisoners suffered from deficiencies in vitamins and minerals that led to specific diseases. Vitamin C deficiency led to scurvy, a disease characterized by bleeding gums, loose teeth, and the breakdown of scar tissue. Some prisoners developed scurvy despite not being in camps where scurvy was expected to occur. Vitamin B deficiency led to beriberi, a disease affecting the nervous system characterized by nerve pain, paralysis, and heart problems. Lack of calcium and phosphorus led to weak bones that were susceptible to fracture even from minor trauma. Lack of iron led to severe anemia that made even light exertion exhausting. The specific diseases that developed in each camp depended partly on which nutrients were most deficient. But virtually all camps had prisoners suffering from multiple vitamin and mineral deficiency diseases. A prisoner named Robert Patterson described the physical symptoms of vitamin deficiency. My teeth became loose and my gums bled. I knew this was scurvy, but there was nothing I could do about it. I needed vitamin C, which came from fresh fruits and vegetables. But we never had fresh fruits and vegetables. Other men developed paralysis in their legs and feet from beriberi. Some men's hearts became damaged. The diseases were preventable. They simply required adequate nutrition. But we were not receiving adequate nutrition. So we developed these diseases and suffered their consequences. Even the small amount of food that was provided was often prepared in ways that diminished its nutritional value. Vegetables were often overcooked, which destroyed some vitamins. Bread was dense and difficult to digest, meaning that some of the calories were lost rather than absorbed by the body. More problematically, the cooking facilities in many camps were inadequate. Cooking was done in large communal pots. Sanitation was often poor. Food was sometimes contaminated with bacteria, leading to intestinal disease that further reduced the prisoner's ability to digest and absorb the limited nutrition available. A prisoner named George Foster worked in the camp kitchen and described the food preparation. The kitchen was filthy. We were attempting to cook in conditions of extreme poor sanitation. The water we used for cooking was often contaminated. The cooking vessels were rarely cleaned adequately. The result was that food was often contaminated when it reached the prisoners. Men would develop diarrhea from the contaminated food. Diarrhea meant they lost what little nutrition they had absorbed from the limited food they had eaten. It was a vicious cycle. The men were starving. They received minimal food. The food was contaminated. They developed intestinal disease. They lost the limited nutrition they had consumed. They starved faster. Beyond the physical deprivation, the lack of food created a profound psychological reality in which hunger dominated prisoners' thoughts. Men would fantasize about food constantly. Men would spend hours dreaming about meals from home. Men would discuss recipes and cooking techniques and favorite foods. Men would trade precious possessions for additional food. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical effect. Men's minds became obsessed with the quest for food. This obsession sometimes interfered with other aspects of survival. Some men became so focused on obtaining food that they neglected other important survival strategies. A prisoner named Charles Romano described the psychological impact. The hunger was not just physical, it was psychological. I thought about food constantly. Every waking moment was consumed by thoughts of food. When I closed my eyes at night, I dreamed about food. I would dream that I was eating a full meal: turkey, potatoes, vegetables, bread. The dream felt completely real. When I woke up, the disappointment of discovering that I had not eaten was almost as painful as the hunger itself. Some men spent hours discussing recipes from home. We would share memories of meals we had eaten before the war. The memories were bittersweet. They provided a kind of psychological satisfaction, but they also intensified the hunger. In camps, an informal economy developed around food and other scarce resources. Prisoners would trade possessions for additional food. A prisoner might trade buttons from his uniform, or personal items from home or labor, for additional bread or soup. This informal economy created opportunities for some prisoners to obtain additional food. But it also created opportunities for exploitation. Some prisoners, particularly those in positions of authority within the camp, would accumulate food through exploitative trades. A prisoner named William Thompson described the trade economy. There were men in the camp who had positions of authority, men who worked in the kitchen or who had favor with the guards. These men had access to additional food. They would trade their additional food for possessions or labor. Some of these trades were fair. A prisoner might trade a valuable item from home for additional food. But some trades were exploitative. A starving prisoner might trade away his only valuable possession for a small amount of additional food, not realizing he had been cheated. Over time, a few men accumulated small amounts of additional food and resources by being clever or ruthless in their trades. Most men had nothing left to trade and remained in starvation. As starvation became more severe, prisoners began to consume things that were not food in any conventional sense. Some prisoners ate tree bark. They would strip bark from trees and eat it. The bark had virtually no nutritional value and was difficult to digest, but it provided some substance and some calories. Some prisoners ate grass and weeds. They would gather whatever vegetation they could find and consume it, even though it was not safe for human consumption and provided minimal nutrition. Some prisoners ate insects and rodents. They would catch rats, mice, or insects and cook them. The meat provided some protein and calories, despite the source being repulsive to most prisoners. Some prisoners drank urine or consumed other substances that might have had some electrolyte value but were otherwise revolting and dangerous. A prisoner named David Foster described the desperation. Starvation drives men to do things that in normal times they would find absolutely repulsive. I ate tree bark. I ate grass. I caught rats and cooked them. I consumed substances that should never be consumed by human beings. But the alternative was to starve. So we did whatever we needed to do to obtain additional calories and nutrients. The desperation overcame the normal revulsion and the normal boundaries of what is acceptable food. A prisoner's access to additional food often depended on luck and on what position he held in the camp. Prisoners who worked in the kitchen had access to additional food. Prisoners who had relationships with guards might receive additional rations. Prisoners who were well-liked by other prisoners might benefit from communal food sharing. But prisoners who were isolated, or who were from different cultural backgrounds, or who were weak or vulnerable, often received less food than their official ration. In some camps, stronger men would take food from weaker men. In some camps, there was an informal hierarchy based on nationality or other factors, and prisoners lower in the hierarchy received less food. A prisoner named Joseph Kaufman described the luck factor. I was fortunate to have a position peeling potatoes in the kitchen. This position allowed me to access additional potato scraps and to occasionally save food to supplement my official ration. Other men were not as fortunate. Some men had no position and received only the official meager ration. Some men were bullied by other prisoners and lost portions of their food. Some men were too weak or too sick to compete for additional food. The difference between my situation and the situation of other men often came down to luck. Luck in what position I had obtained, luck in what relationships I had formed, luck in being physically strong enough to hold my own. The availability of food varied seasonally, which created different challenges at different times of year. In late fall and winter, fresh vegetables were unavailable. Supplies had to come from what had been stored from harvest. In many camps, stored vegetables were limited, and the winter months meant particularly severe deprivation. In spring and summer, it was sometimes possible to find additional vegetation, grass, weeds, tree leaves, that provided supplemental nutrition. Some camps had better vegetable gardens in the warm months. But the cold months were always the most desperate. Men died more often in winter than in other seasons, partly because of the physical challenge of cold combined with malnutrition, and partly because of the reduction in available food sources. A prisoner named Henry Wilson survived multiple winters in captivity. He described the seasonal cycle. Winter was the most difficult season. The cold was brutal, and the hunger was worse. In spring and summer, there were plants and vegetation that we could gather. There were insects and sometimes small animals we could catch and eat. But in winter, there was nothing. The camp's food stores were limited. By midwinter, the food had often run low. The cold meant we needed more calories to maintain body temperature, but we were receiving less food. Men died during winter at a much higher rate than during other seasons. The systematic malnutrition experienced by prisoners of war had long-term physical consequences that persisted for decades after liberation. Prisoners who had been severely malnourished often had difficulty gaining weight even after returning to adequate nutrition. Some prisoners' metabolisms had been permanently altered by severe starvation. Some prisoners developed chronic problems with digestion even decades after the war ended. Some prisoners had permanent stunting of growth. They never reached the height they would have achieved with adequate nutrition. Some prisoners had permanent damage to their teeth from malnutrition and lack of dental care. Some prisoners had permanent weak bones from calcium deficiency. Beyond the visible physical effects, the malnutrition had affected prisoners' health in ways that were not immediately apparent. Some prisoners had damage to their hearts from malnutrition. Some had damage to their nervous systems. Some had reduced immune function that made them susceptible to illness for the rest of their lives. A survivor named Robert Mitchell, examined by doctors decades after his liberation, was found to have permanent stunting of growth from malnutrition during captivity. At age 55, medical examinations suggested that malnutrition during his teenage years of captivity had prevented him from reaching his genetic potential height. He described his experience. "I was approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall when I was captured. If malnutrition had not stunted my growth, I should have grown another few inches. But starvation stopped my growth. I remained at 5 feet 10 inches for the rest of my life. It's a small thing compared to other effects of captivity, but it's a permanent reminder of the starvation I experienced." The psychological effects of chronic food deprivation persisted long after liberation and adequate nutrition had been restored. Some survivors developed eating disorders after the war. Some survivors became obsessed with food for the rest of their lives. Some survivors hoarded food, unable to shake the fear that food would become scarce again. A survivor named George Patterson described the lasting psychological effects. 40 years after my liberation, I still find myself unable to waste food. I still save leftovers obsessively. I still worry about having enough food even though food is abundantly available to me. I will go to restaurants and order food, and then I'll take the leftovers home because I cannot bear to throw food away. My family has learned not to comment on this behavior. They understand that my relationship with food has been permanently altered by years of starvation. The systematic starvation of prisoners of war raises profound ethical questions about the treatment of captive populations and the obligations of nations holding prisoners. The Geneva Convention established that prisoners should be treated humanely and provided adequate food. Germany had ostensibly agreed to these conventions. Yet Germany systematically provided inadequate food to prisoners. Was this deliberate starvation designed to weaken prisoners and extract more labor? Was it simple negligence and mismanagement? Was it the inevitable consequence of wartime shortages? The historical evidence suggests it may have been some combination of all three. But regardless of the cause, the effect was the systematic starvation of hundreds of thousands of prisoners, resulting in death and permanent injury. After the war, military medical personnel examined surviving prisoners and documented the effects of starvation. Medical reports from the immediate post-war period describe prisoners who had lost 30 to 50% of their body weight. Medical reports describe prisoners with bone density that was comparable to people in their 80s despite being in their 20s or 30s. Medical reports describe prisoners with multiple vitamin deficiency diseases, with weak immune systems with permanent damage to organs and systems. These medical reports provide scientific documentation of what prisoners experienced. The reports provide measurable evidence of the systematic starvation that prisoners endured. One of the most poignant aspects of survivors' testimonies is their memory of the taste of food and their obsession with food throughout their lives. Survivors describe in vivid detail the taste of their meager rations, the taste of hard bread, the taste of watery soup, the taste of coffee substitute. These are not pleasant memories, but they are vivid and detailed in a way that suggests how central food was to the prisoner experience. Survivors also describe their fantasies about the taste of food from home. They describe how they would dream about specific foods and specific meals. These dreams were often more vivid and more real-seeming than their actual meals in captivity. A survivor named Charles Wilson, interviewed decades after the war, described his memories. "I can still taste the bread from the camp. It was hard and bitter, with bits of sawdust or straw embedded in it. It was not food that anyone would voluntarily eat. But I can still taste it, and I can still remember the fantasy foods I dreamed about. I can remember dreaming about my mother's apple pie. I can remember dreaming about steak and potatoes. These dreams were more real to me than my actual meals in the camp. When I woke up from these dreams, the disappointment of discovering that I hadn't actually eaten was almost worse than the hunger itself." One of the most important testimonies comes from prisoners' descriptions of their final meals before liberation. When camps were liberated, prisoners were often provided with substantial food for the first time in years. But prisoners' bodies had become so adapted to starvation that the sudden influx of food could be dangerous. Military medical personnel learned to provide prisoners with gradually increasing amounts of food. If prisoners were given too much food too quickly, their digestive systems could not handle it, and they could become seriously ill. But some prisoners ate too much too quickly. Some prisoners ate until they became ill. Some prisoners ate foods that their bodies could not process after years of deprivation. A medical officer named Dr. Samuel Rosenberg described the challenge. "When we liberated camps, we tried to provide prisoners with adequate food, but we had to be careful not to provide too much too quickly. A prisoner who had been starving for years could not suddenly eat large amounts of normal food without becoming ill. Some prisoners understood this and showed restraint. But some prisoners, driven by years of starvation, ate until they became ill. I treated prisoners who had eaten so much after years of deprivation that they had made themselves sick. In a few cases, the sudden change in diet after years of starvation caused complications that contributed to death, even though the immediate danger was over. Survivors often compiled and shared recipes from before the war, recipes for foods they remembered, recipes for meals they had eaten in their previous lives. These recipes were not simply nostalgic. They were attempts to preserve and memorialize the foods of freedom, the foods of home, the foods of normal life before captivity. A group of survivors compiled a book of recipes after the war. Recipes shared by different survivors. Recipes for foods they remembered from their lives before captivity. The recipes were organized by prisoner or by camp. Each recipe was accompanied by the prisoner's name and story. The book served multiple purposes. Preserved memories of home. It provided some therapeutic benefit for survivors to document and share their memories. It created a record of what prisoners had lost. If we were to create a timeline of a prisoner's food experience throughout the war, it would show a progressive deterioration. Early in the war, when camps were smaller and supply lines were functioning better, prisoners received relatively better rations. As the war progressed, as camps became more crowded, as supply lines broke down, rations became smaller and more inadequate. By late 1944 and early 1945, as Germany was losing the war and supply systems had collapsed, many camps provided such minimal food that prisoners were dying of starvation. A prisoner named Henry Grant survived from early in the war until liberation in 1945. He described the food timeline. When I was first captured in 1941, the food was meager but somewhat adequate. We received bread, we received soup, we received occasionally meat. It was not enough, but we could survive on it. But as the war progressed, the food became progressively worse. By 1943, the bread had changed. It had sawdust mixed in, making it less nutritious and harder to digest. By 1944, the soup had become essentially water with a few vegetable scraps. By 1945, we were receiving barely enough food to survive. If I had been captured later in the war, I would not have survived the starvation. Mathematically, it is possible to calculate the minimum caloric intake necessary for survival and the maximum duration a human body can survive on the ration levels provided to prisoners. A man performing heavy labor requires approximately 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day. A prisoner performing labor while consuming 1,000 to 1,500 calories per day is operating at a deficit of 2,000 calories or more per day. Mathematically, this means that every day, a prisoner is losing the caloric equivalent of approximately 0.5 to 1 pound of body fat or muscle. Over the course of a year, a prisoner would lose 200 to 400 pounds. In practice, prisoners did not actually lose 400 pounds in a year because they weighed less to begin with. But the mathematics demonstrate the systematic nature of the starvation. Prisoners were being starved at a measurable, calculable rate. A prisoner who entered captivity weighing 180 pounds could not sustain such a massive caloric deficit for more than a year or two before reaching a critical point where survival became impossible. In contemporary times, survivors and their families preserve memories of the starvation and the food deprivation experienced in camps. Some families have compiled cookbooks of recipes from survivors. Some families have created oral history projects documenting what prisoners ate and the role of food in prisoners' survival and psychological experience. These preservation efforts serve important purposes. They document what prisoners experienced. They preserve memories of survival. They honor the resilience of prisoners who managed to survive systematic starvation. A woman named Sarah Chun, whose father had been a prisoner of war and had experienced severe starvation, compiled a cookbook called Memories of Taste, featuring recipes from her father and other survivors. The cookbook included recipes from before the war, foods that prisoners remembered and dreamed about, as well as recipes for the limited foods prisoners had eaten in captivity. The cookbook served as a memorial to her father's experience and a testament to how central food was to the prisoner of war experience. The history of food deprivation in prisoner of war camps offers an enduring lesson about the nature of starvation and the human capacity to survive systematic deprivation. The lesson is that humans can survive on surprisingly minimal amounts of food for extended periods. But that survival comes at a cost measured in lost weight, in disease, in permanent physical damage, and in profound psychological trauma. The lesson is also that food is not simply about nutrition. Food is about connection to home, about psychological well-being, about hope and meaning. When prisoners were deprived of adequate food, they were deprived not simply of calories but of the psychological anchor that food represents. The lesson reminds us of our fundamental dependence on food for survival and well-being. The lesson reminds us of the cruelty that can result from systematic starvation. The lesson reminds us of the obligation that societies have to treat even enemies and captives with basic humanity. A prisoner named James Mitchell survived the war and lived to age 91. When asked late in his life to describe what he remembered most vividly about captivity, he did not describe the cold, or the violence, or the fear. He described hunger. Mitchell said, "The hunger was constant. The hunger was absolute. The hunger consumed every thought and every moment. I remember the taste of the bread, the bitter, gritty taste with bits of sawdust. I remember the thin soup. I remember the feeling of my stomach digesting itself because there was nothing else to digest. Even now, 75 years after my liberation, I cannot waste food. Even now, I sometimes wake up from dreams about eating, and the dreams seem more real than my current reality. The war took years from me. Captivity took my youth. But the hunger stayed with me forever. The hunger shaped who I became. The hunger taught me lessons about survival and about gratitude for food that I never forgot. The taste of the prison camp bread is still in my mouth. The taste of freedom lost is the taste of that bread, bitter bread that represents both survival and deprivation, both resilience and tragedy. The taste of freedom lost is the taste of starvation, a taste that prisoners experienced and that some never fully forgot, even 75 years later.